Hello, welcome back to Storytime. My name's Josh Keezer and I'm excited to read another story here with you today. More of the Mr. Men library. Don't worry, eventually we will get to the Little Miss series as well. But today we're reading Mr. Bump. This is number 6 in the Mr. Men library and we're trucking on through. I'm excited. Let's do this. Hope you're comfortable and ready because we're about to delve into story time. And be sure to subscribe. If you like reading these stories, click that bell, and then you'll be able to visit and read the stories whenever you want. Okay, let's get this underway. This is the sad story of Mr. Bump. The trouble was that Mr. Bump couldn't help having little accidents. If there was something for Mr. Bump to bump into, he'd bump into it all right. For instance, if you were to see Mr. Bump out walking down a street in your town, if there happened to be something to bump into down that street, then you know what would happen, don't you? Do you think Mr. Bump would bump into it? Let's see. Look at him there. All bandaged up. Yep, he'll bump. Poor little dude's bumped himself into that pole that he's walked past. Conked out on the floor. Mr. Bump was just the same at home. He lived in an extremely nice home, but even there he couldn't help having those little accidents. Look, he has a nice place there. Let's see what kind of accidents he winds up in. For instance, one morning when Mr. Bump went outside his house, he noticed that the chimney pot had come loose in a storm the night before. I must fix that before it falls off, thought Mr. Bump to himself, and he hurried to his garden shed to fetch a ladder. It was a very long ladder. Look at him carrying it. You can see him carrying it there. It almost blends into the fence in the background, but you can see it goes all the way out each side of the page. Wow. Mr. Bump walked up the garden path with the ladder on his shoulder. He turned the corner of the garden path. Crash went the living room window. Oh dear, thought Mr. Bump when he turned to see what had happened. Crash went the kitchen window behind him. Oh dear, thought Mr. Bump again, and he rested the ladder against the wall of the house so that he could climb up onto the roof to mend the chimney pot. But then crash went the bedroom window as well. You can see he's breaking all the windows just like that, poking it with the ladder. Clumsy, bumping into everything. Mr. Bump, always hurting himself and things around him. So you can see how Mr. Bump had his little accidents. Mr. Bump had many jobs, but somehow they never seemed to last very long. I wonder why. As soon as anything got lost or broken or splintered or chipped or snapped or cracked or torn or burst or wrenched or crunched or split or slit, Mr. Bump got the blame. Poor Mr. Bump. For instance, when Mr. Bump worked on a farm, he tripped over the farm dog and spilt the milk which he was carrying for the farmer's wife, and which the farm cat lapped up. Spills all the milk, so then they'll have none left in the house. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a postman, he got his hand stuck in a pillar box, and they had to fetch the fire brigade to come and set him free. Look, if you look real close there, he's got his arm stuck in there. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a bus conductor, he fell off the bus and couldn't catch it up again, and all the passengers travelled without having to pay. That's a real silly one there. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a carpenter, he found that when he was hammering nails, he hammered his thumb most of the time, and the nail hardly at all. He's trying to nail that nail in. He's clearly bent the nail, and he's smacked his thumb. Ouch. That would hurt. In order to recover from this series of rather unfortunate happenings, Mr. Bump decided to take a holiday. There he could think about what sort of job he could do and where he wouldn't be such a nuisance to everybody. Poor guy, he feels like he's a pain and a burden on everyone around him. So off he set to the station to catch a train to the seaside. He's looking a little bit happy there. He's a bit bumped and bruised, but He's still got a smile on his face, which is good. While Mr. Bump was on holiday, several things happened. For instance, he fell off a boat into the sea, and the lifeboat had to come and rescue him. Mr. Bump, he's not even safe at sea. He fell in. For instance, one day when he was quietly walking along the beach, minding his own business, he got his foot stuck in a bucket. And as he couldn't get it off, he had to walk around with it on his foot for hours. That would be so annoying. Walking around with a bucket on your foot for hours. Ooh, it would hurt too. For instance, another time he was walking along the beach when he walked straight into a large hole that somebody had dug. And he had to stay there all night because he couldn't climb out on his own. Oh no, I've gotten hungry. That's where my head goes straight away. Stuck somewhere with no food. Oh. Leave me out of it. However, despite all of these accidents, Mr. Bump enjoyed his holiday, and while he was there, he had a splendid idea about what sort of job he should do. It was quite the best idea Mr. Bump had ever had. An absolutely splendid idea. There's Mr. Bump, his hand there. Poor guys. Fell into the hole. And now Mr. Bump works happily for Mr. Barley, the farmer. Mr. Barley has a rather large apple orchard on his farm, and that's where Mr. Bump works. Look at all the apple trees. Oh. Mr. Bump's job is picking apples, but he doesn't use a ladder to climb up the tree to pick the apples like other apple pickers. Oh no, Mr. Bump has a much better way of picking apples than that. He just walks about. And before long, Mr. Bump, being Mr. Bump, walks into a tree. Bump! And what do you think happens when he walks into the tree and bumps it? You think all the apples might fall out? Yeah, let's see. And down falls an apple. There we go. And Mr. Bump catches it. This makes the job of apple picking much easier. And Mr. Bump is very pleased about his new job. And Mr. Barley is very pleased about his new apple picker. So you see, the story of Mr. Bump isn't such a sad story after all. And if you ever bump yourself, you know what to do, don't you? Mr. Bump catching an apple there, happy with his new job. Now what do you do when you go bump? Go and eat an apple picked by Mr. Bump, and then you won't feel your bump at all. You'll remember that the next time you have a bump, you'll remember that next time you have a bump, won't you? Good. Awesome. Apples are yummy. They are delicious, and it's a good healthy fruit. That way you don't eat candies and lollies and things like that. Alright. Thank you so much for watching Mr. Bump today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like these stories, please subscribe, click that bell below, and you'll be able to visit the page and read stories with me whenever. I'll be back again really soon with another story, okay? Bye for now, but not forever.